Waitress warns the Alpha King. She put something in your cake. 2 hours later. What could have compelled a waitress to speak up at such a critical moment? And what might happen 2 hours later that makes this moment impossible to forget? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy immersive stories filled with suspense, unforgettable characters and dramatic twists, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new adventure. Thank you so much for being here and for supporting the channel with your time, your views, and your encouragement. Before we begin, let us know in the comments. If you witness something suspicious, would you speak up no matter who was involved? Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's step into the story from the very beginning. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one standing between a king and a mistake no one can undo. Emily Carter balanced the white porcelain dessert stand with steady hands as she crossed the polished marble floor of Blackwood Palace, every careful step reflecting in the glass-like shine beneath her shoes. The ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their warm light spilling across elegant gowns, tailored tuxedos, and silver decorations arranged with almost impossible precision. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the moon floated above endless pine forests, its pale glow touching the ancient stone walls of the royal estate. Inside, however, every eye belonged to the celebration. Tonight marked another year of Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood's reign, and nearly every influential family from the Northern Territories had gathered beneath one roof. Emily kept her gaze lowered the way new waitresses were trained to do. Invisible people made fewer mistakes. Invisible people kept their jobs. She quietly reminded herself that she needed this paycheck more than anything. Her younger brother's medical bills waited on the kitchen table back home, and every extra shift meant another prescription she could afford next week. Around her, conversations drifted through the room like soft music. Noble families exchanged polite smiles that rarely reached their eyes. Advisors discussed trade routes. Musicians played gentle strings from the balcony while servers floated between guests carrying sparkling cider, fresh fruit, and handcrafted desserts. Everything looked perfect. Everything sounded perfect. Yet something about the evening felt strangely fragile, as though the entire palace were holding its breath without knowing why. Emily approached the dessert station positioned only a few yards from the royal table. The centerpiece rested there waiting for its final presentation, a breathtaking 3-tier cake decorated with white icing, edible silver leaves, and delicate sugar roses. It looked too beautiful to touch. She reached for the serving stand exactly as instructed. That was when movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. A woman dressed in an elegant emerald gown paused beside the cake. Lady Victoria Hale smiled warmly toward a nearby guest, making certain everyone believed she was simply admiring the decorations. Then, hidden by the wide sleeve of her gown, her hand slipped toward the cake for only a heartbeat. Emily froze. She couldn't clearly see what Victoria's fingers held. She couldn't hear anything unusual. She only noticed a tiny motion, almost too quick to matter, followed by Victoria withdrawing her hand with the same flawless smile she had worn all evening. Emily blinked once. Had she imagined it? The music continued. Glasses clinked together. Laughter floated through the ballroom. No one else reacted. Victoria gracefully stepped away to greet another noble as though nothing at all had happened. Emily looked back at the cake. It appeared exactly the same. Perfect. Untouched. Beautiful. Her heartbeat, however, no longer matched the peaceful rhythm of the orchestra. She tightened her grip beneath the porcelain stand, suddenly aware of how cold her fingertips had become despite the warmth filling the ballroom. Maybe she had misunderstood what she saw. Maybe it was completely innocent. Maybe speaking would destroy her future for no reason. Yet another thought quietly refused to leave her mind. What if remaining silent carried a price far greater than losing a job? Emily could hear her own heartbeat more clearly than the orchestra now. It echoed inside her ears with a steady rhythm that refused to slow, each pulse reminding her that another second was slipping away. The dessert stand felt heavier than before as she lifted it from the display table and turned toward the royal platform where Alpha King Nathaniel Blackwood waited with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to every room falling silent when he entered. He stood near the head table speaking with members of the royal council, his posture relaxed, his silver eyes calm, almost unreadable beneath the golden light of the chandeliers. Stories claimed he could sense dishonesty before a single word was spoken. Others insisted he noticed details that escaped everyone else. Emily had never met him before tonight, and she had no idea which stories were true. She only knew that he looked nothing like the ruthless ruler described in whispered conversations across the territories. He listened more than he spoke. He nodded politely when elderly guests greeted him. He thanked each palace employee who approached his table, including the servers replacing empty glasses. That simple kindness only made the knot inside Emily's chest tighten further. If she was wrong, she would humiliate a man who had shown nothing but courtesy all evening. If she was right, remaining silent suddenly felt impossible. She glanced across the ballroom once more, searching for Lady Victoria Hale. The elegant noblewoman was laughing beside a group of influential families, completely at ease, accepting compliments with graceful confidence. There was no trace of nervousness on her face. No hurried glance toward the cake. No sign that anything unusual had happened. Emily questioned herself again. Perhaps Victoria had simply adjusted one of the sugar flowers. Perhaps the motion she noticed had been completely harmless. She wanted to believe that explanation more than anything. A senior server quietly leaned closer and whispered, "Emily, the king is ready for dessert." She forced herself to nod. Her feet carried her forward almost automatically while doubt followed every step. Guests slowly turned their attention toward the royal table as musicians softened their performance. The celebration had reached its most anticipated moment. Cameras from the palace media team positioned themselves carefully to capture the ceremonial cake cutting. Emily climbed the short staircase leading to the raised platform. She could smell fresh vanilla, sweet buttercream, and warm candle wax. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Nathaniel stepped toward the table with measured confidence, thanking the pastry chef with a warm smile before resting one hand near the silver cake knife prepared for the ceremony. Emily's breathing became shallow. She watched the distance between his hand and the cake shrink inch by inch. Her fingers tightened beneath the porcelain stand until they almost hurt. Every instinct urged her to stay quiet, finish her assignment, and disappear into the background where no one would ever remember her face. That was what invisible people did. They survived by never becoming part of someone else's story. Yet another voice inside her refused to disappear. It reminded her that silence could become a choice she would carry for the rest of her life. Nathaniel reached for the serving knife. Emily felt the decision arrive before she consciously made it. She stepped forward, her hands trembling just enough for the heavy porcelain stand to slip from her grasp. The magnificent cake crashed onto the polished marble floor in a shower of white frosting, broken sugar roses, and scattered silver decorations. A sharp gasp swept across the ballroom. Music stopped. Conversations vanished. Hundreds of stunned faces turned toward the young waitress standing beside the ruined dessert, her breathing uneven as every eye in Blackwood Palace settled upon her. The silence that followed seemed louder than the crash itself. Tiny pieces of sugar decoration slid across the polished marble floor before finally coming to rest, their faint sound echoing through the enormous ballroom. Emily remained frozen where she stood, staring at the ruined cake while her pulse raced so fast she could barely catch her breath. Every lesson she had learned since taking the job repeated inside her mind. Never attract attention. Never interrupt a royal ceremony. Never become the center of the room. Tonight she had broken every one of those rules in a single heartbeat. A palace supervisor hurried forward, his face drained of color before quickly turning red with anger. "Emily Carter, what have you done?" he demanded, struggling to keep his voice controlled in front of the guests. Several servers nearby lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet hers. They knew exactly what this meant. No employee accidentally destroyed the ceremonial cake and kept their position afterward. Whispers spread across the ballroom like a sudden breeze moving through tall grass. Some guests exchanged puzzled looks while others quietly shook their heads. A few assumed the young waitress had stumbled because of nerves. Others believed she had simply been careless. Lady Victoria Hale slowly stepped toward the center of the gathering with perfectly measured concern painted across her face. She looked down at the scattered frosting before lifting sympathetic eyes toward the Alpha King. "What an unfortunate accident," she said gently. "The poor girl must be terrified." Her voice sounded warm enough to comfort anyone listening, Yet something inside Emily felt colder the moment she heard those words. Victoria looked directly at her, and for the briefest instant, the corner of her smile shifted almost imperceptibly before returning to its graceful calm. Emily understood then that she had not imagined what she saw beside the cake earlier. She could not explain why, but certainty settled inside her heart. Nathaniel had not spoken a single word since the cake fell. Instead, he simply observed the room. His expression remained composed, revealing neither frustration nor sympathy. His silver eyes moved slowly from the shattered dessert to Emily, then toward Victoria, before returning once again to the young waitress whose hands still trembled at her sides. Emily realized that every second she remained silent made her actions appear even more reckless. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to lift her head despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. Fear pressed against her chest, but another emotion pushed even harder. She could not walk away now. Her voice came quietly at first, almost lost beneath the whisper surrounding her. "Your Majesty." The room gradually became silent again. Emily took one slow breath before continuing. "I did not drop the cake by accident." A ripple of surprise spread through the guests. Even the palace staff looked toward her in disbelief. The supervisor stared as though he wished she would stop talking immediately. Emily could feel her knees threatening to weaken beneath her, but she remained standing. She looked directly at Nathaniel, refusing to let her eyes wander anywhere else. "I believed someone had done something to it." The words seemed to hang motionless in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Lady Victoria blinked once before releasing a soft laugh filled with polite disbelief. "That is quite a serious claim," she said calmly. "Surely there is some misunderstanding." Emily slowly turned toward her. Her heartbeat remained unsteady, yet her voice became firmer than she expected. "I saw you standing beside the cake moments before it was served." Gasps quietly traveled through the ballroom once again. Every face shifted from Emily to Victoria and then toward the Alpha King, whose calm expression had not changed at all. For several long seconds nobody spoke. The grand ballroom that had been filled with music and celebration now held only the weight of uncertainty. Emily could feel hundreds of eyes measuring every expression on her face, searching for hesitation, fear, or regret. She found all three inside herself, yet none of them changed what she believed she had seen. The palace supervisor stepped closer, lowering his voice enough to sound respectful but firm. "Do you understand the accusation you have just made?" Emily slowly nodded. "Yes." "Then take it back before you make this even worse." She looked at the shattered cake scattered across the marble floor and quietly shook her head. "I cannot." Murmurs rose again among the guests. Some frowned with disbelief while others exchanged curious glances. Several members of the royal council whispered behind folded hands. No one expected a young waitress to stand by such an extraordinary claim. While facing the most powerful people in the territory, Lady Victoria placed one graceful hand over her heart, her expression touched with gentle sadness rather than anger. "Your Majesty," she said softly, turning toward Nathaniel, "the poor girl is frightened. She has made an unfortunate mistake and is trying to justify it. I hope no one judges her too harshly." Her calm voice drew sympathetic nods from several guests. It was the perfect response, measured and compassionate. Emily almost questioned herself again. Almost. Nathaniel remained silent. His attention never lingered on the growing whispers. Instead, he studied Emily with the same steady gaze he had worn since the cake struck the floor. There was no accusation in his eyes, but there was no reassurance either. It was as though he were waiting for something only she could provide. Emily realized this was the moment that would define everything. If she retreated now, everyone would remember her as a careless employee who invented a story to escape punishment. If she continued, she risked losing far more than her job. She thought of her younger brother waiting at home, smiling every time she promised things would get better. She remembered her mother teaching her years ago that fear should never become another name for silence, when someone else's safety might depend upon the truth. Emily drew one careful breath. "I cannot prove what I saw," she admitted honestly. "I only know what I witnessed." The honesty surprised the room. She was not pretending to have evidence she did not possess. She was not demanding anyone believe her without question. She simply refused to deny what she believed was real. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice calm enough that everyone immediately became quiet. "Do you have any witness?" Emily answered without hesitation. "No, Your Majesty." "Do you have any physical evidence?" "No." "Then why would you risk everything by making this statement?" Emily looked directly into his silver eyes. Her hand still trembled, but her voice no longer did. "Because if I stayed silent and I was right, I would never forgive myself." Another deep silence settled across the ballroom. Even those who doubted her sincerity could not ignore the simplicity of her answer. She had not asked for praise. She had not begged for mercy. She had only explained the reason behind her choice. Nathaniel lowered his gaze briefly toward the remains of the dessert before looking back at her once more. Emily straightened her shoulders and accepted whatever consequence might come next. "If I am wrong," she said quietly, "you may punish me however you believe is fair. But if I am right, then I hope this moment is remembered for the truth, not for the broken cake." Nathaniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward with the same measured composure that had defined every movement since the celebration began. His polished shoes stopped only a few feet from the broken dessert, and he lowered his eyes to the scattered frosting without a trace of frustration. Around him, the ballroom remained perfectly still. Emily realized that every guest was waiting for the Alpha King to decide not only her future, but the direction of the entire evening. The palace supervisor shifted uneasily before clearing his throat. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should escort the waitress outside while the celebration continues." Nathaniel raised one hand slightly. The supervisor fell silent at once. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet authority, the kind that required no explanation. Nathaniel slowly looked toward the head pastry chef. Was this cake under continuous supervision from the moment it entered the ballroom? The chef hesitated. "It was watched by palace staff, Your Majesty, but several guests approached to admire the decoration throughout the evening." Nathaniel gave a single thoughtful nod. His silver eyes moved across the room, lingering for only a moment on Lady Victoria before returning to Emily. Victoria offered a graceful smile that appeared untouched by concern. "I cannot imagine anyone wishing to disrupt such a joyful occasion," she said gently. "Surely this is only an unfortunate misunderstanding." Nathaniel acknowledged her words with a polite glance but offered no agreement. Emily noticed something unexpected. He was listening to every voice in the room, yet he was revealing nothing about his own thoughts. The uncertainty became almost unbearable. Guests whispered quietly among themselves, each conversation ending with another curious look toward the young waitress who had interrupted a royal celebration. Emily could almost hear the judgment forming around her. Careless, desperate, foolish. She accepted every possibility except one. She would not call herself dishonest. Nathaniel finally turned toward the palace security captain. "Remove every remaining piece of this dessert." Several officers stepped forward immediately, carefully gathering the cake from the marble floor, and placing every fragment into sealed serving containers instead of throwing it away. A wave of confusion spread through the ballroom. Emily noticed the smallest change in Lady Victoria's expression. It lasted less than a second. Her smile remained, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly before returning to perfect composure. Nathaniel continued speaking in the same calm voice. "No one is to consume any portion of it." The order surprised nearly everyone. If he believed Emily had fabricated the accusation, there would be no reason to preserve the dessert. If he believed Victoria was guilty, he would have acted immediately. Instead, he chose neither path. He chose patience. Emily found herself studying him with cautious curiosity. He had not defended her. He had not condemned her. He had simply refused to make a decision before gathering more information. That restraint felt strangely reassuring. Nathaniel looked back at Emily one final time. "Until this matter is clarified, you will remain inside the palace." Her stomach tightened. She could not tell whether those words offered protection or punishment. "You are not to leave the grounds," he continued. "You will be treated respectfully, and you will answer any questions truthfully." Emily lowered her head. "Yes, Your Majesty." Without another word, Nathaniel turned toward the orchestra. "The celebration will continue." Music slowly returned to the ballroom, hesitant at first, then growing steadier as guests reluctantly resumed their conversations. Yet nothing felt the same. Laughter sounded forced. Smiles seemed carefully practiced. Beneath the elegance of crystal chandeliers and polished silver, uncertainty had quietly taken a seat at every table. And somewhere beyond the graceful music, an invisible clock had already begun counting down toward a truth that none of them could yet see. 2 hours passed with painful slowness. Emily sat alone inside a quiet reception room overlooking the moonlit gardens, her untouched cup of tea growing cold beside the window. No one had locked the door, yet 2 palace guards remained outside with calm professionalism, reminding her that freedom and confinement could sometimes look remarkably alike. She replayed every second of the evening in her mind, questioning herself again and again. Had she truly seen Victoria reach toward the cake, or had fear woven an ordinary gesture into something far more dangerous? Each time doubt surfaced, she remembered that fleeting smile, the hidden movement beneath the emerald sleeve, and the uneasy feeling that had settled over her long before the dessert reached the royal table. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer that she had not destroyed her future for an illusion. Elsewhere inside Blackwood Palace, the celebration had gradually become quieter. Guests continued speaking in polite voices, yet the earlier joy never fully returned. Small circles of nobles exchanged theories behind crystal glasses, while palace employees carefully avoided discussing the incident aloud. Nathaniel remained composed throughout the evening, greeting visitors, listening to reports, and thanking every family before they departed, revealing nothing about the thoughts hidden behind his steady silver eyes. Lady Victoria appeared equally graceful, offering warm smiles and effortless conversation. Anyone watching from a distance would have believed the uncomfortable interruption had already faded into memory. Shortly after the final guests began leaving, the head pastry chef entered the royal kitchen carrying one of the sealed containers that held the remains of the dessert. He looked toward Nathaniel's chief steward and spoke quietly. "We cannot simply preserve this forever. We should determine whether there was truly anything unusual." The steward considered the suggestion before nodding once. A senior food safety specialist employed by the palace happened to be finishing inventory nearby. After examining the damaged dessert visually, he requested permission to perform a simple precautionary taste evaluation using only the smallest amount necessary, following long-established palace protocol whenever contamination was suspected but no immediate laboratory result was available. Permission was granted. Everyone watched silently as the specialist carefully collected a tiny sample of frosting no larger than the tip of a spoon. First, nothing happened. The room remained still except for the ticking of an antique clock mounted above the pantry doorway. 1 minute passed. Then another. Several employees exchanged uncertain looks, and one young assistant quietly exhaled in relief. Perhaps the waitress had truly been mistaken after all. Then the specialist paused. He lowered the spoon, pressed one hand lightly against the edge of the preparation table, and frowned with visible confusion. "Something feels unusual," he said softly. His face gradually lost its healthy color. He remained standing fully conscious, but his balance became uncertain enough that 2 nearby employees immediately stepped beside him and guided him into a chair. The palace physician, who had remained on site because of the royal gathering, arrived within moments. After a brief examination, the physician looked toward the steward with unmistakable seriousness. "He should recover," the physician said calmly, "but whatever was present in that sample should not have been there." The kitchen fell completely silent. No one spoke. No one questioned the meaning of those words. Upstairs, a palace guard hurried through the corridor leading toward Nathaniel's private office. At nearly the same moment, another guard changed direction and headed toward the quiet reception room where Emily still waited beside the window, unaware that the invisible countdown she had feared all evening had finally reached its end. The knock at the reception room door was gentle, but it carried a weight that immediately drew Emily to her feet. One of the palace guards stepped inside and bowed respectfully. His expression had changed since escorting her there earlier. The suspicion that had lingered in his eyes was gone, replaced by quiet professionalism. "Miss Carter," he said, "His Majesty has ordered that you remain comfortable while the palace conducts an official investigation." Emily searched his face for some clue about what had happened, but he revealed nothing more. After he left, She looked through the tall windows toward the courtyard below. The palace had changed. Lanterns burned brighter along every pathway. Additional guards moved between entrances with calm purpose, speaking into communication devices and checking every delivery record from the evening. No one appeared frightened, but everyone seemed focused. Somewhere beyond those stone walls, the truth had begun moving faster than rumors. Inside the royal office, Nathaniel stood beside a large oak table covered with guest lists, service schedules, security reports, and handwritten kitchen logs. The palace physician had already confirmed that the food safety specialist was expected to recover completely after receiving immediate care. Yet the physician repeated one conclusion with absolute certainty. Something unusual had been present in the dessert. Nathaniel listened without interrupting. When the physician finished, the Alpha King simply nodded once before looking toward the captain of the royal guard. "Seal every kitchen entrance until the inspection is complete," he instructed calmly. "No employee leaves the palace until every statement has been recorded." The captain acknowledged the order without hesitation. Nathaniel then turned toward another advisor. "Collect every security recording covering the ballroom, the dessert station, and the service corridors beginning 1 hour before the ceremony." Across the palace, employees quietly gathered in interview rooms where investigators politely asked each person to describe the evening in precise detail. Some remembered seeing Lady Victoria admire the cake. Others remembered speaking with Emily shortly before the ceremony. Many had noticed nothing unusual at all. Every answer was documented without accusation. Nathaniel wanted facts, not assumptions. Meanwhile, Lady Victoria remained inside a beautifully furnished guest suite, reserved for distinguished visitors. She accepted tea with the same graceful smile she had worn throughout the celebration, and thanked the palace attendant for checking on her comfort. Once the door closed, however, she slowly walked toward the window overlooking the moonlit gardens. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Calm, elegant, controlled. Yet her fingers tightened around the porcelain teacup just enough for the delicate china to tremble almost imperceptibly. She had expected the broken cake to disappear with the evening's embarrassment. Instead, every passing minute seemed to pull unwanted attention toward a moment she believed everyone would dismiss. Back in the reception room, Emily quietly folded her hands together to stop them from shaking. She had imagined countless endings to the night, but none resembled this strange silence. No one had accused her again. No one had apologized either. She still had no evidence beyond what she witnessed with her own eyes. Doubt lingered beside hope, refusing to leave. Then footsteps approached once more. This time there were several voices outside the door. The handle turned slowly, and the palace steward entered with measured respect. "Miss Carter," he said softly. "His Majesty would like you to answer a few additional questions." Emily took a slow breath before following him into the brightly lit corridor, unaware that somewhere deep inside the palace, the first pieces of evidence were finally beginning to align with the truth she had risked everything to protect. Emily followed the palace steward through a series of quiet corridors where every polished floor reflected the warm glow of antique wall lamps. The celebration had ended, but Blackwood Palace remained awake. Clerks carried folders from one office to another. Guards stood outside every entrance with calm discipline. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint ticking of a grandfather clock marking each passing minute, reminding her that the truth often arrived more slowly than fear. The steward opened the doors to a private conference room where Nathaniel already stood beside a long walnut table covered with photographs, handwritten reports, and a large digital display connected to the palace security system. He looked up as Emily entered and gave a small nod. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice carried the same steady calm as before, neither warm nor cold. Emily quietly took the seat offered to her. Across the table, the captain of the royal guard adjusted the display until footage from the ballroom appeared on the screen. The recording showed guests arriving, musicians performing, and servers moving through the crowd with practiced precision. Emily watched herself crossing the ballroom carrying trays long before the ceremony began. Everything looked ordinary. Then the recording shifted to the dessert station. Nathaniel folded his arms without speaking. Every person in the room focused on the screen. Lady Victoria entered the frame exactly as Emily remembered. She paused beside the ceremonial cake while greeting another guest. One camera angle was partially blocked by a decorative column, hiding most of her right hand. Emily felt her heart sink. It was impossible to see what Victoria had been doing beneath the wide sleeve of her elegant gown. Then the captain switched to a second security camera positioned higher above the ballroom. This angle captured only a brief moment, but it revealed something different. Victoria glanced over both shoulders before moving closer to the cake. Her hand disappeared beneath the edge of the top layer for less than 2 seconds before returning empty. The image was not perfectly clear, yet it matched Emily's memory with unsettling precision. No one spoke. Nathaniel continued watching the recording until it reached the exact moment Emily stepped toward the dessert stand. He asked for the video to be replayed twice more. Each viewing uncovered another small detail. Victoria looked toward the nearest musicians immediately after withdrawing her hand, almost as though confirming that attention had shifted elsewhere. Emily arrived less than 15 seconds later. Nathaniel finally looked away from the screen. "Miss Carter," he asked quietly, "is this the movement you described?" Emily nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty. That is exactly what I saw." Before anyone could respond, another investigator hurried into the room carrying a transparent evidence pouch. Inside rested a tiny decorative silver leaf recovered from the broken frosting. "Our laboratory completed the preliminary examination," the investigator reported. "The unusual substance was not mixed throughout the entire dessert. It appears to have been placed only on one serving area near the ceremonial first slice." Emily felt a chill travel through her arms. If the cake had been served normally, only the first portion would have reached Nathaniel. The rest of the guests might never have noticed anything unusual. Nathaniel accepted the report without changing his expression, but his silver eyes grew noticeably sharper. He turned toward the captain of the Royal Guard. "Invite Lady Victoria to join us," he said calmly. "Tell her there are a few details that require clarification." As the captain left the room, Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment, realizing that what had begun as a lonely suspicion was no longer supported only by her memory. Piece by piece, the evidence was beginning to speak for itself. Lady Victoria entered the conference room with the same effortless grace she had displayed throughout the evening. Her emerald gown remained flawless, and her smile carried just enough warmth to suggest complete confidence. She greeted Nathaniel with a respectful nod before allowing her eyes to drift briefly toward Emily. There was no open hostility in her expression, only quiet surprise, as though she still believed the young waitress had somehow wandered far beyond her place. Nathaniel invited her to take a seat without revealing anything about the evidence already gathered. The room remained silent for several long seconds, interrupted only by the faint ticking of the antique clock hanging above the fireplace. Finally Nathaniel spoke. "Lady Victoria, several details from tonight require clarification." She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Of course, Your Majesty. I will gladly answer any question." Nathaniel nodded toward the security display. The recording began playing once more. Victoria watched herself appear beside the ceremonial cake. She smiled politely when the footage showed her greeting nearby guests. Then came the brief moment when she stepped closer to the dessert. Her eyes followed the recording carefully, but her expression remained remarkably composed. When the video ended, Nathaniel asked only one question. "Why did you approach the cake?" Victoria answered without hesitation. "I admired the craftsmanship. The sugar roses were extraordinary. I simply leaned closer for a better look." Nathaniel accepted the response with a thoughtful nod. "Did you touch it?" She smiled gently. "Not that I remember." The captain of the Royal Guard quietly placed a printed photograph on the table. It showed the higher camera angle where Victoria's hand disappeared beneath the upper edge of the cake for several seconds. She studied the image before looking back toward Nathaniel. "The angle is unclear," she replied calmly. "It could easily create the wrong impression." Emily remained silent. She watched Nathaniel instead of Victoria, searching for any sign of frustration. There was none. His calm never changed. Another investigator stepped forward carrying the laboratory report recovered from the decorative silver leaf. The unusual substance was located only near the ceremonial serving position, he explained. It was not distributed throughout the dessert. Victoria slowly turned toward the investigator with carefully measured curiosity. How unfortunate, she said softly. Perhaps someone tampered with it before the cake entered the ballroom. Nathaniel looked directly at her. That possibility is being examined. Once again, he revealed nothing about his conclusions. Emily realized he was allowing every answer to settle naturally beside the evidence instead of rushing toward judgment. Then Nathaniel reached for another folder lying unopened on the table. He slid a visitor access log across the polished wood. According to palace security records, he said evenly, everyone who entered the preparation corridor this evening signed in. Electronically. Victoria glanced at the document for only a moment before returning her attention to him. That seems entirely reasonable. Nathaniel opened the folder and removed one final page. There is one detail I have not mentioned until now. The room became perfectly still. Even the investigators stopped writing. Nathaniel's silver eyes rested on Victoria with quiet certainty. I never intended to eat the cake after Miss Carter spoke. The moment she warned us, I ordered every remaining portion preserved without announcing it publicly. I wanted to see who would believe the matter had ended, and who might reveal more than intended. For the first time that evening, Victoria's confident smile faded ever so slightly before she quickly regained her composure. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Nathaniel. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. Sometimes the smallest change lasted less than a heartbeat, yet revealed far more than an entire evening of carefully chosen words. Morning light filtered through the tall stained glass windows of Blackwood Palace, painting long ribbons of gold across the marble floor where the royal court had gathered once again. Word had spread quickly during the night that the Alpha King wished to address an important matter before the day's official meetings began. Nobles who had attended the celebration returned with quiet curiosity, while senior advisors took their places along the chamber walls. Emily stood near the entrance wearing the same simple waitress uniform from the evening before. It had been neatly pressed by the palace staff, yet she still felt painfully out of place among embroidered jackets, jeweled gowns and generations of powerful families. She lowered her eyes, expecting whispers to follow her every step. Instead, the room remained unusually quiet. Nathaniel entered the chamber with calm confidence, and everyone immediately rose to their feet. After acknowledging the court, he turned toward Emily instead of the gathered nobles. The unexpected gesture drew every gaze in the room toward the young waitress. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken once again. She wondered whether this would finally be the moment she faced punishment for disrupting the royal celebration, despite everything that had happened afterward. Nathaniel remained silent for several seconds before speaking in a steady voice that reached every corner of the chamber. Last evening, a palace employee made a decision that interrupted an important ceremony. Several nobles exchanged knowing glances. Emily quietly accepted the words, believing the criticism was only beginning. Nathaniel continued without changing his calm expression. At the time, many believed her actions were reckless. A few heads nodded in agreement. Then his next sentence changed the atmosphere of the room completely. The investigation has established that her warning prevented a far more serious mistake from taking place. Silence settled across the chamber with remarkable speed. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seats. Nathaniel slowly walked toward Emily until only a few feet separated them. "Emily Carter," he said clearly, "you acted without certainty that anyone would believe you. You accepted personal consequences because you believed remaining silent carried greater risk than speaking honestly." Emily looked up, unable to find words. Nathaniel turned toward the assembled court. Courage is not measured by position, wealth, or family name. Sometimes it is measured by the willingness to stand alone when the truth has no witnesses. The words echoed through the chamber. Emily noticed several palace employees standing quietly near the rear entrance. The same supervisor who had scolded her after the cake fell now lowered his head with visible embarrassment. He stepped forward slowly and spoke before the entire court. "Miss Carter, I judged you too quickly. I sincerely apologize." His voice carried genuine regret. Emily blinked in surprise before offering a small nod. "Thank you," she answered softly. Nathaniel looked across the room once more. "From this day forward, no member of my household will be treated with disrespect because of rank alone. Character will always deserve more attention than appearance." Several advisors placed their hands over their hearts in acknowledgement of the royal declaration. Emily felt something inside her finally begin to loosen. The fear she had carried throughout the longest night of her life slowly gave way to quiet relief. She had arrived at the palace believing invisible people survived by remaining unnoticed. Standing before the Alpha King, with an entire royal court watching in complete silence, she realized that sometimes the bravest choice was allowing the truth to be seen, even when it placed every part of your future at risk. The royal court remained standing long after Nathaniel finished speaking, not because protocol demanded it, but because no one seemed ready to break the silence. Emily still struggled to believe that the same room which had expected her disgrace only hours earlier had now witnessed her name spoken with respect. She quietly stepped back, hoping to disappear once more into the background, but Nathaniel was not finished. He turned toward the captain of the royal guard and gave a single nod. The captain walked to the center of the chamber carrying a sealed folder marked with the royal crest. Every conversation stopped. "The investigation has concluded," the captain announced. "Security recordings, laboratory findings, electronic access records, and witness interviews all support the same sequence of events." He opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. Lady Victoria Hale knowingly approached the ceremonial dessert without authorization. The physical evidence recovered from the serving area matches the location identified by Miss Carter during her original statement. Her description remained consistent throughout every interview, and aligned with the security recordings obtained afterward. A quiet wave of disbelief spread through the gathered nobles. Several exchanged uneasy glances, remembering how quickly they had dismissed the young waitress. Lady Victoria stood with remarkable composure despite every eye turning toward her. She lifted her chin slightly and spoke in the same elegant voice that had impressed so many people the night before. "I maintain that appearances can be misleading." Nathaniel met her gaze without anger. "That is why we relied upon evidence rather than appearances." His answer settled over the room with calm finality. No accusation was exaggerated. No harsh words were necessary. Facts alone carried enough weight. The captain continued reading from the report. "Under the authority granted to the Crown, Lady Victoria Hale will remain under formal investigation, while the Royal Council completes the remaining legal procedures." Two palace officers stepped forward with quiet professionalism. They did not rush or raise their voices. They simply invited Victoria to accompany them according to royal protocol. For the first time since arriving at the palace, the confident smile she had worn so effortlessly disappeared completely. She looked toward Emily for only a brief moment before following the officers from the chamber. The heavy doors closed softly behind them. No celebration followed. No applause echoed through the hall. Nathaniel had no interest in humiliating anyone, even at the moment the truth prevailed. Instead, he faced the assembled court once again. "Justice is not strengthened by public shame," he said evenly. "Justice is strengthened when truth is allowed to stand on its own." Those words seemed to affect the room even more deeply than the investigation itself. Emily noticed several nobles lowering their heads in quiet reflection. They had judged her by her uniform before listening to her voice. The lesson was impossible to ignore now. As the court slowly began to disperse, palace employees approached Emily one after another. Some thanked her for her courage. Others apologized for doubting her. Even servants she had never met offered warm smiles as they passed. None of it erased the fear she had experienced. Yet each small act of kindness reminded her that respect earned through honesty carried far greater value than approval gained through silence. Standing beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows, Emily realized that the greatest change had not happened inside the investigation. It had happened inside the hearts of everyone who had witnessed an ordinary waitress refuse to abandon the truth simply because she stood alone. After the royal court adjourned, the palace gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Advisors disappeared into meeting rooms, servants resumed their duties, and the echo of formal announcements faded into quiet conversation. Emily lingered near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, uncertain whether she should leave or wait for further instructions. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Palace, she no longer felt invisible, yet she was not sure she knew how to exist any other way. She gently smoothed the sleeves of her simple uniform, still unable to believe that everything had changed in less than a day. Soft footsteps approached across the polished floor. Emily turned and immediately lowered her head when she saw Nathaniel walking toward her without guards, advisors, or attendants. The distance between a king and a waitress had never seemed greater, yet his calm expression carried none of the formality she expected. He stopped beside the window, looking out toward the gardens where morning sunlight rested across rows of white roses. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt peaceful instead of uncomfortable. Nathaniel finally broke it with a quiet question. "May I ask you something, Miss Carter?" Emily nodded. "Of course, Your Majesty." He looked toward the gardens rather than at her. "When you stepped forward yesterday, you had no evidence. You knew almost everyone would doubt you." His voice remained thoughtful. "Why did you still choose to act?" Emily lowered her eyes to her hands. She searched for a complicated explanation but found only a simple truth. Because someone had to. Nathaniel slowly turned toward her. She continued before fear could silence her. "I kept thinking that if I stayed quiet only because I was afraid, I would remember that decision for the rest of my life. Losing my job would have been painful. Living with regret would have been harder." Nathaniel listened without interrupting. There was no trace of judgment in his silver eyes, only quiet understanding. Emily smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by how ordinary her answer sounded. "I did not expect anyone to thank me," she admitted. "I only hoped I was not too late." Nathaniel allowed those words to settle between them before speaking again. "Most people believe courage feels like confidence." He shook his head gently. "In my experience, courage usually arrives while someone is frightened." Emily looked at him with quiet surprise. She had imagined kings possessing certainty beyond ordinary people. Hearing him describe courage that way somehow made him seem more human than any story she had ever heard. A light breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of pine trees and fresh roses into the corridor. Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a small silver pin shaped like the royal crest. It was simple, elegant, and carried no jewels or unnecessary decoration. He held it out to her. Emily hesitated. "Your Majesty, I cannot accept something so valuable." Nathaniel smiled for what felt like the first time since the celebration began. It was quiet, sincere, and unexpectedly warm. "Its value does not come from silver," he replied. "It comes from what it represents." Emily carefully accepted the pin with both hands, treating it as though it were something fragile. "Whenever you begin doubting your own voice again," Nathaniel said softly, "remember that honesty protected this palace when titles and reputation could not." Emily closed her fingers around the small crest, feeling tears threaten to reach her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had entered Blackwood Palace believing that kindness often went unnoticed. Standing beside the Alpha King beneath the morning light, she finally understood that true kindness was not invisible at all. Sometimes it simply waited for the right moment before revealing its quiet strength. Emily left Blackwood Palace just after noon, the crisp mountain air carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain across the long stone pathway leading toward the front gates. The royal crest Nathaniel had entrusted to her rested safely inside her coat pocket, its gentle weight serving as a quiet reminder that the previous day had truly happened. She paused once before reaching the gate and looked back at the ancient palace rising against the blue sky. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had walked through those doors hoping only to finish another shift without being noticed. Now she carried home something far greater than a day's wages. She carried the knowledge that one honest decision could change far more lives than fear ever could. As she continued toward the village road, several palace employees waved from a distance. The same people who had barely noticed her arrival now greeted her with genuine respect. Emily smiled warmly before continuing her walk. Nothing about her clothes had changed. Nothing about her family name had changed. Yet somehow the world around her felt different because people had finally looked beyond both. High above the courtyard, Nathaniel stood alone on a balcony overlooking the valley below. His chief advisor quietly approached carrying a leather folder containing the final investigation reports. "Everything has been completed, Your Majesty," the advisor said. Nathaniel accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. Instead, He watched Emily become smaller along the winding road until the trees gradually hid her from view. "There is one more matter," the advisor continued. "The palace personnel office has prepared a permanent position for Miss Carter should she ever wish to return." Nathaniel gave a thoughtful nod. "Leave the invitation open," he replied. "Opportunities offered freely carry more honor than obligations." The advisor smiled with quiet understanding before stepping away. Nathaniel finally opened the folder. Most of its pages summarized evidence already known, but one document had been added overnight by the Palace Archives Department. It contained a routine background review prepared after Emily unexpectedly became central to the investigation. His eyes moved calmly across the page until they stopped on a single handwritten note attached by the chief archivist. According to old employment records, Emily's late mother had once served as a junior librarian inside Blackwood Palace nearly 20 years earlier before leaving unexpectedly following a confidential royal assignment. Nathaniel read the sentence twice. He remembered the name immediately. It had appeared years ago in stories his father once told him, connected to an event that had quietly disappeared from official history. He closed the folder slowly, thoughtful rather than surprised. Far below, Emily continued walking toward home, completely unaware that an old chapter of the palace archives had just reopened because of her. She believed the story had ended with a broken cake, a difficult choice, and justice finally restored. She did not know that destiny sometimes waited patiently behind forgotten records instead of dramatic legends. Nathaniel rested one hand on the stone balcony and looked once more toward the distant forest where the road disappeared beneath towering pines. A faint smile crossed his face as sunlight broke through the clouds. Sometimes the greatest turning point in a kingdom did not begin with armies, ceremonies, or crowns. Sometimes it began with one ordinary person who refused to ignore a quiet warning inside her heart. And somewhere within the silent shelves of the royal archives, a forgotten truth was waiting for the day their paths would cross again.